So, what are the options if it is not if judges are not appointed by the Attorney General? Do we want a system where judges are appointed by electors directly?
Episode of Beneath the Law. My name is Gavin Ty, here with Stephen Teal as always, and ready to rock and roll. What do you say, Stephen?
I'm ready to go, but I better not shout or I'll overmodulate or something.
Yeah, we don't want you overmodulating again.
And we don't want you overmodulating either.
That is overmodulation is one of the great ills of the podcast universe, and we will try to avoid it at any cost. We try to moderate, not overmodulate on any given particular issue.
We're poking fun at our great producer, Doug Downs, who sits in behind the scenes, helps us out, but you know, Gavin and I can be very expressive and very loud sometimes.
We tend to overmodulate, and we'll try to keep our wavelengths in check. So today we're going to talk about some serious overmodulating and great pearl clutching that has gone on of late in regards to comments by the Premier of Ontario. And full disclosure, we know the Premier of Ontario. We have acted for the Premier of Ontario. And he's fair to say, Stephen, he's a plain-spoken fellow.
And I
he says what he means and means what he says.
Look, and I think that's really the issue with respect to this topic that we're going to talk about, which is his comments about judicial appointments to the Ontario Court of Justice. And look, he is a plain-speaking individual. He's tough on crime. Does not like seeing repeat offenders get bail and then commit another crime while they're on bail. So he's made some comments with respect to that. And a couple of his former staffers, I guess, in his office, were appointed to the Judicial Appointment Committee for Ontario Court of Justice judges. And it has created a lot of controversy because not only did he make the initial comments, but the critics are saying that he doubled down, tripled down, quadrupled down, and he's not shy about it. I think he's actually said himself, look, I am doubling down or tripling down on my comments because that's his belief in terms of the crime file, that people who commit crimes are getting out on bail too easily. And he would like to see judges who, don't so easily allow people out on bail. And so that's created a lot of controversy because his views basically look like they're interfering in the judicial appointment process.
Right. I mean, and let's just give our listeners a quick background on how this works. In the province, in Canada, we have provincial governments and we have federal governments, and they have different jurisdictions. And the province here has the authority to appoint justices of the peace, which are fairly low-level judges, and judges to the Ontario Court of Justice. And the Ontario Court of Justice generally deals with family law matters, child protection matters, lesser criminal offenses, provincial offenses like traffic tickets and that type of thing, and then other types of provincial offenses. On the criminal side, Ontario Court of Justice judges deal with criminal bail hearings, which is really where this came out of. They deal with what's lesser convictions, or which are called summary conviction prosecutions, and preliminary hearings or trials for most indictable offenses, which are the higher level of criminal offenses. And for certain criminal matters, an accused can elect to be tried by justice of the Ontario Court of Justice. So how do judges get appointed? Well, in Canada, judges are appointed by the Attorney General, both provincially and federally. And the appointment process, generally, you've got to be a lawyer. You have to have a minimum of 10 years experience practicing law. And then you've got to make an application to a committee, which is structured to make recommendations to the AG about who should be appointed and who shouldn't. In Ontario, most of the people on the committee are frankly lay people. They're not lawyers at all. They are two judges. One is on the committee, one appointed by the Chief Justice of Ontario, and one appointed by the Chief Justice of the Ontario Court of Justice. And the others are appointed by the Ontario Judicial Council, which is like a body of judges that oversees all of the judges. Then, in addition to that, from the legal community, the lawyers on the committee are appointed by the Law Society of Ontario, the Ontario Bar Association, and the Federation of Ontario Law Associations, which is all the individual law associations of all the various counties across the province. The committee then goes through applications. They decide on a list, and then they send a list up to the Attorney General in Queen's Park. The Attorney General can say yay or nay, say, sure, I like the names, or give me some more names, which is I'm not taking your recommendation. So ultimately, the veto, if you will, of who gets appointed in Ontario is in the hands of the AG. And I guess the question is, should it be? Who should, in a democratic society, be appointing judges? Should it be the elected ministers of the Crown, who are theoretically elected by the people, or should it be some other body that of wise people who decide that they know better and they get to decide who the judges are going to be? I mean, I know what I think. I think that we live in a democratic society, and that duly elected governments are elected to implement the institutions of the state, and one of those is the judiciary. And I think that is completely appropriate that government appoint judges.
Well, look, the process is inherently political. I think that's where we have to start. I'm just going to back up a little with respect to Premier Ford's comments, and that he's very plainly spoken. And I guess a lot of the criticism is being leveled at him because his comments draw to the forefront the political nature of the entire process. Who else, you asked the question, who else is going to appoint the judges? So what are the options if judges are not appointed by the Attorney General? Do we want a system where judges are appointed by electors directly? If we do that, then we're kind of into an American system. And, when I'm in the United States watching TV and during the election period of time, you have people running on specific platforms, that they are tough on crime, or, that they're a little bit more lenient, or that kind of thing. Certainly the tough on crime, the Republican approach is, we're going to put those criminals in jail. And that's how they run. And there's fundraising that's done for all of these positions. And is that a better system than what we have now? In terms of the controversy with respect to the judicial appointment process, what we had was Premier Ford appointed the two former staffers to the committee as lay people. One has been named chair of that committee. And what are they doing? Well, they're overlooking now or overseeing applications. They're not soliciting applications. That's not how the committee works. It doesn't have a nominating committee. It's Gavin, you or I could fill in an application. And then it's up for the committee to, give a thumbs up or a thumbs down in terms of whether you're even interviewed or not. And that's the process. But at the end of the day, the people who are appointed to the committee, they're just making recommendations. And the power sits in the hands of the Attorney General. But I don't know of any better system to appoint judges. Everybody's going to have a bias regardless of who it is.
Well, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, that's one of the issues that the detractors of this. It's interesting because they're detracting on the provincial level at the moment, the most vocally, but the process is really not a lot different at the federal level. I mean, the Liberal government in Ottawa has been criticized recently for not making enough appointments to the bench. certainly in regards to delays in criminal trials, which have led to accused being released and charges withdrawn because of the delay being considered to be too far and breaching what has been determined to be a constitutional threshold of delay. But I mean, certainly, there's there's no question that the appointment of the judiciary is inherently political in Canada because they are appointed ultimately by politicians. And politicians are elected. And if politicians, as with any other appointments, that is what they are elected, frankly, to do, isn't it? I mean, politicians are elected to implement government. Government is implemented by the appointment of various people to implement government programs or institutions, or in this case, appointing judges to the bench. I mean, in the United States, it's arguably become hyper politicized. I mean, we saw the great debates about U.S. Supreme Court justice appointments and how that is such an important power of the federal government and of the president. But I don't know that is it any different in Canada? I mean, we seem to think, oh, look at this, terrible that they've politicized the bench. But I mean, the Supreme Court in Canada is appointed by the federal government. What's the difference?
Well, and to be quite frank and full disclosure, I mean, Premier Ford speaks frankly. I think you and I speak frankly on this podcast as well. There are people who lobby for the position to be appointed as a Supreme Court of Canada judge. And there are people that they know who lobby the Attorney General of Canada to appoint a certain person to be a judge of the Supreme Court of Canada. So that's the reality of what happens in the Canadian context as well. I think, stepping back in terms of Premier Ford's comments, I think one of the criticisms that may have merit in it is that when the Premier speaks, or any leader speaks for that matter, with respect to the way they want to see cases dealt with in the court system, judges should not be feeling that they are beholden to what a particular leader or politician is expressing, and that they should make independent decisions. And I think that's my understanding of the comments that were made by a recently retiring Court of Appeal judge, Judge Doherty, when he gave his retirement speech, that a judge should not administer the justice system the way that a politician would suggest that the justice system should be administered, that they should be making the decisions based on what the legislation says and what the precedent is.
Well, okay, so I'm going to take some exception to that comment, and simply because I think that, in fairness, there's many institutions in society that are similar. I think about it as follows. I mean, judges are appointed by government, but they can't be removed by government. So it's there's no ability, for example, of the premier in a province to remove a judge that they don't like their sentencing, what they've been doing. Once they're a judge, they're a judge. And I look at that very much like not dissimilar to tenure in the academic setting. I mean, professors are appointed by universities. The university appoints the professor to that position. Presumably but then they're given tenure. Why? They're given tenure so that they can't be removed because they think a certain way, or they write a paper that the university doesn't like, or that it doesn't follow a certain way of thinking that someone wants. The tenure is theoretically there as a protection. Aren't judges in the same type of situation? They're appointed, but then they are required under their oath and should be judging things fairly and impartially. They're certainly not towing party lines after they're judges. I mean, they're still human beings, but they're theoretically, they are there and they have protection, and they're not going to get fired because they rule against the government on a certain case. I mean, judges rule against the government all the time.
I don't disagree with that, Gavin. But putting it in the context of a leader's comments, in terms of, or any politician's comments, in terms of the way that they would administer justice. I think that's what it gets to. Judges, like professors, are independent. Once I'm appointed as a professor, let's say, the university shouldn't be dictating how I teach my class, or dictate what my views are. And so it's the same, I guess, in terms of when the body that appoints anybody to a position begins to speak of their values and the way that they would do things, that the sense out there is that those who have been appointed will drift and adhere to that. And, I always hearken back, Gavin, in terms of the judicial system to the Nuremberg trials, and how judges basically made decisions that were in support of the Nazi regime rather than actually applying the laws that they should have been. And that's why we had these trials, because the judges themselves basically ended up supporting that Nazi regime because they weren't doing what their oath of office would expect them to do, which is to be neutral and to be free from that kind of political interference. And so that's where I think, in my view, that's where this whole tension and criticism arises. And look, Premier Ford he's free to express himself on a political, in a political perspective, because he's running to get votes. He's tough on crime. I'm tough on crime. I think you're tough on crime too. We don't like to see criminals running around and easily necessarily getting bail so that they can recommit crimes. And that's that's appealing to a lot of people. They want to be safe in their communities, and so the premier should certainly feel free to speak about that.
Well, I think I draw this distinction between getting appointed and after you're appointed. And I think that, and I think that realistically, and I mean, I don't think there's too many people walking around that believe otherwise. I don't think that people realistically believe that any government, including the federal government, are going to appoint people to the bench who they think radically disagree with their worldview or the way they see the world. So, I mean, I don't think they're going to be, appointing to the bench, for example, the lawyers who are representing the trucker convoy or the criminal trial. I think those lawyers' chances of having a federal judicial appointment are fairly slim. And I don't think anyone would suspect that would be otherwise. I mean, I think that the reality of it is that most people, I think, assume, I mean, certainly in the federal context for the Liberal government here in Canada, I mean, a great many of their appointments have been Liberal donors, etc., who have, I think, they've got a very large contingent of their appointments. I mean, whether that's why they were appointed, I'm not suggesting that's the case, but it's not offensive to me. Even though, whether I agree with that or don't agree with that, doesn't really matter. It's not offensive to me to think that a government will appoint people who they think will bring to the bench a view that they share and agree with.
Well, values, not just the views.
But once they get there, I think one of the great hallmarks of a true democracy is that a judge, once appointed, is not beholden to the government that appointed them. There is no mechanism where the government can turn around and say, "Oh, we want a mulligan on that appointment because we're going to pull him back or her back." I think that the judiciary is completely independent. The judiciary, regardless of what government appoints them, is entirely free and required and compelled to exercise their judgment freely, fairly, and without bias. And to listen to the case and rule against government if they see fit. And I think judges do that. I think many great judges do that. But the suggestion that the original appointment is not innately political, I mean, there's a lot of merit that goes into it. I know that. And there's a lot of great judges on the bench. But it's a political appointment. You're appointed by the Attorney General, who is an elected official. And whether you agree with the government, if you don't like the appointments of a government, then elect another government. And that ultimately, the tenure of the bench will eclipse. I'm using that word because of the week we had an eclipse here in
Oh
Ontario.
yeah, well we could really see it in Toronto, Gavin. Let me tell you, through the clouds.
The clouds.
That
The
was
clouds
a
were a
great
little
eclipse.
darker than they usually were. But it will. I mean, an appointment to the bench is a life appointment theoretically. I mean, governments come and go in 4 years. So to me, the democracy, the check and balance in the democracy in a democratically elected appointment process. Is that every 4 years you get the chance to elect somebody who might appoint people who look at things differently if you don't like what they're doing. And that doesn't just apply to the bench. It applies to all of the appointments across the board that a government makes to implement its policies.
Well, and quite frankly, that goes to who gets appointed to committees. Government has a lot of appointments to make. There are a lot of committees of basically volunteers or people who want to have an interest in helping government out. And who gets appointed is very much dependent on who gets elected. And you're absolutely right. If you don't like the folks who are appointed to these committees and that there's some kind of controversy, change the government. And then they're going to appoint, let's face it, they're going to appoint their friends and the people that they know.
Yeah, well, and
that's the reality.
I mean, people get offended about that, and I may not like some of the appointments of some governments that I may not agree with, but I completely, as democracy is one of those things, you got to hold your nose and take it when it doesn't go your way, which is exactly the point. I think democracy is tested in the losing. So I think that people need to understand that you may not like the fact that, but I may not like the policies of a certain government that gets elected. Maybe, many people don't, but I certainly believe in their ability to implement the policies that they were elected to do. And I hold my nose and work harder the next time to try to get the government that I want, or the policies that I want in office. And that's what democracy is all about, isn't it?
Well, it's when I look at I think there are some justified criticisms for sure with respect to political comments that are blatant interference. As Premier Ford interfered in the process, I kind of maybe I'm sitting on the fence more and more with respect to that. I'm not sure that there is blatant interference in the process. A couple of guys got appointed. I don't know what their backgrounds are, Gavin, but at the end of the day, it's 7 lay people. Who am I to judge, or who is anybody to judge necessarily who gets appointed? People who are qualified for appointments are criticized just because of who they know, without looking at the quality of the appointment. And so that's unfair too. But at the end of the day, offer me a better process then. Right?
Well, what is the better process?
Right, and that's the question. Is there a better process?
Well, I mean, that's really the issue. I mean, we know that. I know, for example, there's a lawsuit now by a group called Democracy Watch. They're self-styled apparent crusaders for democracy watch. I find it quite interesting and paradoxical that they call themselves Democracy Watch, and that yet they're espousing a view that judges should be appointed by who? By some Star Chamber group of elites who know better than everyone else, and they decide who the judges are going to be. I mean, to me, that goes back to sort of the aristocratic view that we can't leave the power in the great unwashed because goodness knows who they might come up with. But I mean, ultimately, that question remains unanswered. The notion they're bringing a constitutional challenge that says that the process whereby the AG appoints the elected AG appoints the judiciary, they say is unconstitutional. Well, I sure hope that an elected body appoints judges, because otherwise, whoever is appointing judges is answerable to nobody. They're certainly not answerable to the electorate, and the electorate has the option to kick the kick the bums out every 4 years, and that ultimately, that's why in a democracy the voter has the hammer. And I don't know. I think it's the most undemocratic possible thing to suggest that positions such as the bench should be filled by anybody other than someone who is duly elected by the electorate. If that were not the case, then again, who's going to appoint them? God, the king, who appoints the judiciary?
That's what really strikes me about the criticism. We're leveling the criticisms, but nobody is giving an option. Democracy Watch has brought a challenge. As you say, they brought a challenge to the way that federal judges are appointed as well. And they lost in front of the federal court.
As they should.
Right?
Because,
so,
right.
It's what's the option? Then let's maybe address it at the committee level. Who should be on the committee? Why are lay people making decisions as to who should be a judge? Shouldn't people who have skills in the justice system be the ones making the appointments? I don't know. Maybe that's the debate. But
yeah, the committee that is the recommendation committee. I mean, that's the important
right.
point.
It's a recommendation.
Ultimately, they don't make the appointment, but ultimately they have an ability to recommend. I mean, they are weighted with lay people. There are more lay people on the committee than there are lawyers. That's arguable.
And you and I, frankly, and nobody else sits in that committee room when the applications go in. Do the judges or the lawyers who sit on that committee hold a persuasive view over the lay people?
One would just assume. One would assume so. It would just similarly to, if you're presumably if you were in the position of appointing medical authority and you had a group of people, hopefully you'd listen to the doctors more than you'd listen to the lay people. But then again, not necessarily. I often, there are so many great judges, but the ability to administer justice, the ability and understanding and experience necessary to be a great judge, is not necessarily something that is just a checkbox on like a various categories that you fit into. It takes a lot more than that. It takes quite frankly, it takes judgment. That's what makes a great judge. And judgment is not something that is gauged by checks on a box. So in any event, I think that the point of this all is that the great wringing of hands and gnashing of teeth in regards to the fact that politicians appoint the judiciary and that it is therefore inherently a political process is one that I'm pretty glad that we have it that way. And I certainly applaud both levels of government, and that is the most inherently democratic aspect of the judicial appointment process in Canada.
Look, it's never going to be a perfect system, one way or the other. But I agree with you, Gavin. I certainly, in the Canadian context, would not want to see a system where a person who wants to be a judge has to run in an election and be voted to be a judge.
Yeah, because I come back to the point. I like our system for one reason only, that once judges are appointed, they are tenured, so to speak. They are independent. They don't have to worry about recall. They don't have to worry about re-election. They don't have to worry about, okay, I've got to pander to the popular will. They can do what's right, what they believe is right. They can follow their conscience. They can make difficult decisions without worrying whether they're popular or not. And ultimately, that may be the biggest advantage of the Canadian system, where we don't elect our judges, is that we don't have to re-elect them. And I don't have a problem with democratic appointments of judges, but I do have a bit of a problem with the politicization of the actual act of being a judge post-appointment. And I think those are two very different things. Anyway, a very interesting discussion as always, Stephen. Thanks very much. Thanks. Shout out to our producer, Doug Downs, for his impeccable work in keeping us undermodulated. And to you, our listeners, thank you for listening. Please send us any reviews, comments, criticisms, kudos, and rate us if you can. Tell your friends. Post us on your social if you have such things. And once again, always remember that if no one is above the law, then everyone is beneath it.